Greg was drilling out my lock at 7 in the morning. Not knocking, not calling. Just standing there with a locksmith and a clipboard, trying to break into my shop because I committed the horrific crime of leaving a cardboard box next to a full recycling bin. When I screamed at him to stop, he smiled that seagull choking laugh and told me I had 48 hours to clear out my junk, or he would rent a dumpster and do it himself. His brother Chad, yes, actual frosted tip Chad, was already measuring my showroom for his premium vape lounge. I am just the arcade guy after all. The guy who fixes pinball machines and pays more rent than the other 3 units combined. What Greg did not know was that I spent that entire weekend tracking down the actual owner of the building. An 82-year-old man in Florida who had no idea his property manager was fabricating lease violations to evict paying tenants for family favors. One phone call later, I owned the entire building. 30 days after that, I got to watch Greg carry his life down the stairs in cardboard boxes while his lifted white truck finally saw some actual use hauling trash bags and energy drink cans. The look on his face was worth every penny. You know that feeling when you are just trying to mind your own business, do your job, pay your taxes, and maybe enjoy a decent cup of coffee, but the universe decides to test your sanity by dropping the most incredibly annoying human being directly into your daily life? I am talking about a guy who exists purely to make you question the laws against throwing people into a dumpster. If you have ever rented commercial space, you probably already know exactly the type of guy I am talking about. Let me tell you about Greg. Greg was the property manager of the little commercial strip where I ran my business. I want to be clear right off the bat. Greg was not the owner. Greg just acted like the owner. He had the title of property manager, which, in his mind, was roughly equivalent to being the supreme emperor of a small, concrete nation. I run a vintage arcade and pinball restoration shop. It is a niche business, sure, but I love it. I take machines from the 1980s and 1990s that have been rotting in damp basements, and I bring them back to life. It takes hundreds of hours of soldering, woodworking, and painting. People pay good money to have a pristine piece of their childhood glowing in their living room. My shop was in the perfect spot. It was an old brick building built in 1972, right on the edge of the downtown district. The ground floor had 4 retail spaces. I occupied the largest one on the end because I needed the loading dock for the heavy machines. Above the retail spaces, there was exactly 1 residential apartment. Guess who lived there? Greg. Greg lived rent-free in the upstairs apartment as part of his compensation for managing the 4 units downstairs. Managing is a very strong word for what Greg actually did. What Greg actually did was wear terrible cologne that smelled like a middle school locker room mixed with artificial pine and walk around with a clipboard trying to intimidate people who actually worked for a living. Greg drove a massive, lifted white pickup truck. You know the exact truck I'm talking about. It had tires the size of a dining room table, a pristine truck bed that had never seen a single piece of lumber or a bag of dirt, and a suspension so high he practically needed a step stool to get into the driver's seat. He parked it horizontally across 3 spaces in the back lot. When I asked him to move it so a freight delivery could drop off 2 vintage pinball cabinets, he just laughed. He had this laugh that sounded like a seagull choking on a French fry. It was a high, nasal sound that made my blood pressure spike instantly. He told me the parking lot was for preferred tenants, and since I was just the arcade guy, I could figure it out. That was the dynamic. I was paying a ridiculous amount of rent every single month on time, without fail, and Greg treated me like a loiterer who had wandered in off the street. Things were tense, but manageable for the first 3 years. I kept my head down. I fixed my machines. I dealt with his occasional petty complaints about the noise of my air compressor or the smell of soldering flux. But then, my business started to really take off. A couple of popular retro gaming channels featured my restoration work. Suddenly, I had a waitlist that was 12 months long. I hired 2 assistants. I bought a second delivery van. We were busy, we were profitable, and most importantly, we were happy. That is when Greg started acting weird. He started hanging around the shop more often. He would stand near the loading dock, wearing these tight polo shirts that highlighted his complete lack of muscle tone, sipping an energy drink and just watching us move machines. He started making little comments about how much money I must be making. He would ask invasive questions about my profit margins. I tried to deflect, giving him vague answers, but you could see the gears turning in his head, or at least the one rusty gear that was left. A few weeks later, the petty harassment escalated into outright warfare. It started with a notice taped to my front door on a Tuesday morning. It was a formal warning for a lease violation. The violation? Improper disposal of cardboard. I went out to the alley. The cardboard in question was a single flattened box sitting neatly next to the recycling bin because the bin was full of empty energy drink cans. Greg had taken a photo of the box, printed it out on a color printer, and attached it to a 3-page document citing municipal codes that he had clearly just Googled. I was annoyed, but I threw the box in my van and took it to the dump myself. 3 days later, another notice. This one was for unapproved aesthetic modifications to the storefront. I had put a small neon sign in the window that said, "Open." That was it. A sign I had used for 3 years. Suddenly, it was a violation of Clause 14, Section B of the lease agreement, which he claimed prohibited illuminated signage without written consent from the property manager. I marched up the stairs to his apartment, my knuckles white from gripping the notice. I pounded on the door. He answered wearing a silk robe at 2 p.m. I asked him what his problem was. He just gave me that smug, punchable smile and told me he was just enforcing the rules, and if I did not like it, maybe I should consider relocating. I told him my lease was locked in for another 4 years. His smile faltered for a second, just a tiny bit, before he shut the door in my face. I could not figure out why he was suddenly trying to drive me out. I was the anchor tenant. I paid more rent than the other 3 units combined. The other spaces were a struggling yarn store, a tax prep office that was only open 3 months a year, and a vacant unit that smelled like old soup. Why attack the golden goose? The answer walked into my shop a week later. His name was Chad. I'm not making that up. His name was actually Chad, and he was Greg translated into a slightly younger, slightly louder package. Chad was Greg, but with frosted tips and a leather jacket that creaked every time he breathed. Chad walked around my shop, not looking at the beautiful restored machines, but looking at the square footage. He tapped the walls. He looked at the ceiling height. He actually pulled out a laser measuring tape and started pointing it across my showroom floor. I walked up to him, wiping grease off my hands with a rag, and asked him if he was lost. He looked at me like I was a piece of gum on his shoe. He said he was checking out the space for his new business, a boutique, premium vape, and alternative wellness lounge. I stared at him. I told him this space was occupied, and I had a lease. Chad chuckled, a sound eerily similar to the choking seagull laugh of his brother. He said, "Yeah, my brother manages the building. He says you are having some compliance issues and might be out of here by the end of the month. I am just getting a head start on the layout." My vision actually blurred. You know when people say they see red? I always thought that was a metaphor. It is not. My peripheral vision went fuzzy, and a hot wave of pure, unfiltered rage washed over my entire body. This was not about cardboard. This was not about a neon sign. Greg was trying to fabricate a paper trail of lease violations so he could break my lease, evict me, and give my prime, heavy-duty, high-traffic retail space to his idiot brother to sell flavored air and overpriced gummies. I did not yell at Chad. I did not punch him, even though my knuckles were practically vibrating with the desire to do so. I just calmly told him to leave my shop before I called the police for trespassing. He held up his hands in a mocking surrender, told me to chill out, and sauntered out the door. I locked the door behind him, flipped the neon sign off, and walked to my back office. I sat in my cheap desk chair and just breathed for 10 minutes. I was terrified. I am not going to lie and say I morphed into a legal genius right then and there. I was a guy who fixed circuit boards and painted pinball flippers. I did not have a massive legal fund. All my money was tied up in inventory, parts, and payroll. If Greg managed to lock me out, even illegally, the disruption to my business would ruin me. I had custom machines and pieces across my workbenches. I had client deposits. I had a reputation. A prolonged legal battle over an eviction would bleed me dry, which is exactly what Greg was counting on. He knew I was a small business. He knew he held the keys, literally and figuratively. That weekend, the anxiety hit its peak. I could not sleep. Every time a car drove past my house, I thought it was Greg driving his stupid white truck to my shop to throw my tools into the street. I decided I needed to go to the shop on Sunday morning just to check on things. I pulled into the alley behind the building at 7 in the morning. Sure enough, Greg was there. He was standing by my back door with a guy wearing a blue work shirt holding a drill, a locksmith. Greg was trying to drill out the lock on my steel security door. I slammed my van into park, did not even turn off the engine, and sprinted toward them. I shouted at the top of my lungs, asking what the hell they were doing. The locksmith jumped back, clearly startled. Greg did not flinch. He just held up his clipboard. He said I was in default of my lease due to uncorrected violations and unpaid fines. Fines I had never agreed to or even been legally served. He said he was reclaiming the property on behalf of the owner. I looked at the locksmith. I told the guy, "If you put that drill bit within an inch of my door, I am calling the cops, and I am pressing charges for attempted burglary." I pointed to the security camera mounted above the door, a camera Greg had forgotten I installed last year. The locksmith looked at the camera, looked at Greg, packed up his drill, and walked to his van. He told Greg to call him when the dispute was settled. Greg was furious. His face turned a shade of crimson that usually indicates a severe medical emergency, and veins actually popped out in his neck. He started screaming at me, spitting as he talked, telling me I was finished. He said I was a loser playing with toys and that his brother was going to turn this place into a real gold mine. He said I had exactly 48 hours to clear out my junk, or he would rent a dumpster and do it himself. I stood my ground. I told him he had to take me to court. I told him he could not just change the locks. He laughed that awful laugh again. He said, "Who is going to stop me? The owner lives 2,000 miles away and does not care. He trusts me. I am the law around here. That was the mistake. That was the moment Greg handed me the rope to hang him with. The owner. The actual owner of the building. I had never met him. When I signed the lease, all the paperwork was handled through a generic real estate holding company, and Greg was the sole point of contact. Greg collected the rent checks. Greg signed the maintenance forms. I realized I had absolutely no idea who actually owned the bricks and mortar of my livelihood. I went inside, locked the heavy steel door behind me, and booted up my computer. I did not fix any machines that Sunday. I became an amateur private investigator. I went to the county property appraiser website. I searched the address. It took hours of clicking through nested menus, deciphering tax codes, and cross-referencing business registries. I finally found the holding company. Then, I found the registered agent for the holding company. Then, I found a name. Arthur. An 82-year-old man living in a retirement community in coastal Florida. I did not write him a letter. I did not send an email. I found a phone number listed under his name in a public directory, took a deep breath, wiped my sweaty palms on my jeans, and dialed. It rang 6 times. I was about to hang up when a raspy voice answered. I introduced myself. I explained that I was the anchor tenant in his commercial building. At first, Arthur was confused. He asked why I was not talking to Greg. He said, "Greg handles all the headaches." That was the magic word. Headaches. I asked Arthur if he knew Greg was trying to illegally evict his highest-paying tenant to move in a family member who wanted to open a vape shop. There was a long silence on the phone. Arthur sighed. It was the tired, heavy sigh of an old man who was exhausted by life. He told me he was tired of Greg. He told me Greg was constantly complaining about the building, asking for money for repairs that never seemed to fix anything, and constantly whining about how hard the tenants were to manage. Arthur said he bought the building 25 years ago as an investment, but now it was just a giant weight on his shoulders. He said he just wanted to be done with it. He wished he could just sell the whole damn thing and play golf in peace. My heart stopped. The world around me completely vanished. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights in my shop faded out. Sell it. Sell the building. I looked around my shop. I looked at the rows of beautiful, restored pinball machines. I looked at the custom woodwork, the tools I had bled over, the business I had built from absolute zero. I did not have a trust fund. I was not rich. But I had excellent credit, a business that was pulling in serious profit, and a desperate, burning desire to destroy Greg. I asked Arthur, right then and there on the phone, how much he wanted for the building. He chuckled. Not a mean chuckle, just surprised. He named a number. It was high. It was a massive amount of money. It was $1,200,000. But for a commercial building in this part of town with 4 units and an upstairs apartment, it was actually below market value. Arthur wanted a fast, quiet exit. No real estate agents, no giant open houses, just a clean break. I swallowed the giant lump of terror in my throat and told him I wanted to buy it. I told him I would give him his asking price, but I needed 30 days to secure the commercial financing, and most importantly, Greg could not know. Arthur loved the idea. He thought it was hilarious. He hated Greg too, it turned out. Greg had been skimming off the top of the maintenance budget for years, and Arthur knew it, but was too old and tired to fight him. The next 30 days were the most stressful, agonizing, terrifying days of my entire life. I was fighting a war on 2 fronts. On one front, I was dealing with Greg, who had decided to make my life a living hell. He started parking his giant white truck directly in front of my main entrance. He turned the building water off for 3 hours every afternoon, claiming emergency pipe repairs, which meant my employees could not use the restroom or wash their hands. He played terrible, thumping electronic dance music from his upstairs apartment until 3 in the morning, making the ceiling panels in my shop vibrate. He sent me daily threatening letters, slipping them under my door, demanding I vacate. I ignored all of it. I smiled at him when I saw him in the parking lot. I waved. It drove him absolutely insane. He thought I was in denial. He thought I was just too stupid to realize I was beaten. On the other front, I was living at my bank. I met with my loan officer, a very stern woman named Brenda, who looked at my financials like she was dissecting a frog. I showed her my books. I showed her the waitlist for my restorations. I showed her the rent roll for the building. I explained my plan. Brenda was skeptical. Commercial loans are not easy to get, especially for a guy whose primary asset is a warehouse full of vintage Pac-Man machines. I had to empty every single savings account I had. I had to cash in my modest retirement fund. I put every single penny I possessed, down to the loose change in my cup holder, into the down payment. I barely slept. I ate nothing but cheap noodles and stale coffee. I was sweating through my shirts during every single phone call with the title company. There were moments where the loan almost fell through because of a zoning technicality. There was a moment where the appraisal came in slightly low, and I had to beg a private investor friend to bridge the gap with a short-term loan. It was messy. It was ugly. I thought I was going to have a heart attack at least 4 times. I was so stressed my left eyelid developed a permanent twitch. But I kept my mouth shut. Greg suspected nothing. His brother Chad even showed up one day with a contractor, pointing at my walls, talking loudly about knocking them down to build a custom glass display case for their premium vaporizers. I just kept soldering wires, fixing flippers, and letting the music play in my head. Finally, the day arrived. It was a Friday. The closing was scheduled for 1 in the afternoon. I drove to the title company office. I sat at a massive mahogany table and signed my name on what felt like 400 pieces of paper. My hand was cramping. My stomach was doing backflips. But when the escrow officer handed me a thick manila folder and said, "Congratulations, you own the building," I felt a wave of euphoria so strong I almost passed out. I was no longer a tenant. I was the landlord. I owned the brick. I owned the pavement. I owned the roof. And most importantly, I owned the upstairs apartment. I drove back to the shop. I parked my van. I did not park in my usual spot. I drove right to the back lot, and I parked horizontally across 3 spaces directly in front of the stairs leading up to Greg's apartment. I walked into my shop. I went to my office. I had prepared a special document the night before with the help of a very expensive real estate attorney. I printed it out on crisp, heavy stock paper. I put it on a clipboard. I walked back outside. Greg was already coming down the stairs, his face purple with rage. He had seen my van parked across the spaces. He was wearing his stupid tight polo shirt and holding his own clipboard. He marched right up to me, jabbing his finger in the air. He started screaming. He told me to move the van immediately. He told me this was the final straw. He said he was officially locking me out at midnight. The police were already notified, and my junk was going to the dump. He was so incredibly arrogant. He was practically bouncing on his heels with glee. He said, "You are done. Pack your toys and get off my property." I let him finish. I just stood there, looking at him. I noticed for the first time that his expensive sunglasses had a tiny scratch on the left lens. I noticed his ridiculous shoes. I let the silence hang in the air for a good 10 seconds. Then I lifted my clipboard. I handed him the crisp, heavy stock paper. I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Actually, Greg, it is my property now. I bought the building from Arthur an hour ago. The deed is recorded. I am the owner. And this is your official 30-day notice of eviction from the upstairs apartment. Your services as property manager are no longer required, effective immediately. Also, you have exactly 10 minutes to move your ridiculous white truck off my property, or I am having it towed." I wish I could adequately describe the sequence of emotions that crossed Greg's face in that moment. It is a memory I will cherish on my deathbed. First, it was confusion. He looked at the paper. He read the heavy black text. He saw the official county recording stamp. Then, it was denial. He shook his head. He let out a weak, breathy version of his seagull laugh. He said, "This is a fake. This is a joke. You cannot afford this building." I told him to call Arthur. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, dialed Arthur on speakerphone, and held it up. Arthur answered. I said, "Hey, Arthur, Greg does not believe we closed." Arthur's raspy voice came through loud and clear. He said, "Greg, you are fired. Pack your stuff. Good riddance." And he hung up. The denial shattered. The reality hit him like a freight train made of cast iron. His face went completely pale. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish that had just been dropped on a hot sidewalk. The clipboard in his hand actually slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the concrete. The supreme emperor of the concrete nation had just been overthrown by the arcade guy. I did not gloat. I did not scream back at him. I just leaned in a little closer and said, quietly, 30 days, Greg. Leave the keys on the counter." Then I turned around, walked back into my shop, and locked the door. The aftermath was glorious. For the next 30 days, I got to watch Greg carry his life down those stairs in cardboard boxes. His brother Chad showed up once to help him move a mattress. Chad did not look at me. He kept his head down, the frosted tips looking significantly less cool as he struggled to shove a cheap futon into the back of the pristine white truck. The truck bed finally got some use, holding trash bags full of Greg's clothes and his collection of empty energy drink cans. They did not speak to me. They did not make eye contact. I stood by my loading dock, sipping a great cup of coffee, and just watched them load up and drive away. The truck bottomed out on the dip in the driveway as they left, scraping the pristine bumper on the concrete. It was music to my ears. I immediately renovated the upstairs apartment. I tore out the nasty carpets that smelled like Greg's cologne and put in hardwood floors. I rented it out to a very quiet nurse who works night shifts and pays her rent 2 weeks early. The empty unit downstairs that smelled like old soup. I knocked down the wall and expanded my showroom. The yarn store and the tax prep place are still there. I lowered their rent by 5% because they are good people, and I could afford it since I was not paying a fake property manager a ridiculous salary to harass my tenants. My business is thriving. The pinball machines have never sounded better. Every morning, I pull into my parking lot, park in a single properly lined space, and unlock my front door. I do not have to worry about fake fines. I do not have to worry about illegal lockouts, because I hold the keys to the whole damn thing. And every time I look at that set of keys, I smile thinking about a guy named Greg sitting somewhere in his lifted truck, realizing that you should never, ever push the quiet guy in the corner too far. Because the quiet guy might just buy the ground you are standing on and tell you to take a hike.